Okay, well, it's 6:03, and I hate to keep those of you who have been prompt waiting, but I know we'll have some more joining as we move forward tonight. Excuse me. Well, thank you for joining tonight's town hall. This is on the Tahoe Basin Area Plan Amendments, Phase 2 housing. And we have a number of presenters tonight. Um, I'm just introducing the topic and then turning it over to Alyssa Bettinger from senior planner with TRPA, and then Chris Pahuli, our planning director with Placer County Community Development Resource Agency, and Emily Setzer, a principal planner with our Community Development Resource Agency. But I wanted to set the stage and give a little bit of background and history to those of you joining us tonight. Back in 2021, I believe, Alyssa, TRPA started the working group on housing amendments and started studying what we could do to encourage housing that would be affordable to our local workforce. And that takes a range of everything from affordable housing up to what we call achievable, where it's deed restricted. All of it is deed restricted, but the top level is doesn't have an income cap, but it does say you must work for a local employer. So for those who are in a little bit higher income, middle class employees also have access to the housing stock because we're missing that at all price ranges in our community. And so with that, the working group, of which is a subcommittee of the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, and I served on your behalf, met for 2 years. I think we had 9 or 10 public meetings, and Alyssa can tell you more about that process. But in December of 2023, TRPA adopted these amendments with the option that local jurisdictions, if they could find other ways to incentivize development of more housing, could substitute those. In the meantime, the county continued work on a number of different projects and programs through our housing programs, but didn't find any other incentives that seemed to meet the criteria that would have us moving forward with housing alternatives. So the board this year directed our staff to go ahead and move these forward through both the TRPA and the county process, which we'll cover tonight as well. But I wanted to give you again a bit of background on what that means. So statewide, we all know we have a housing challenge. I serve on a number of committees throughout the state that are struggling with this. Every jurisdiction, every county, every city is struggling on what we do with workforce and affordable housing projects. The state has required the jurisdictions to meet certain numbers and their share of housing. For us in the Tahoe Basin, the RHNA numbers, which is the Regional Housing Needs Allocation numbers, are 435 that of unincorporated Tahoe Placer needs to meet 435 units. Now, many of us on the call and many participating know that's what the state says we need, but those of us living here have seen the change in our community, transitioning to second homeowners and having less people to actually do the work we so desperately need. So I would say that that's the number the state would require, but we have a great deal of need at every income level in that affordable bridge of numbers of units. And so as we move forward tonight, I hope we can, number one, answer your questions as you hear after you hear the presentations, and number two, dispel some of the myths of what this could mean for our community, because I've received quite a few emails and appreciate that many people are confused by where this would go, what it would mean, and how we're focused on delivering housing here. So please, I appreciate, and if you'll hold your questions and type them into the chat, we will answer those as at the conclusion of the presentations tonight. And so with that, I wanted to introduce Alyssa Bettinger. She's a senior planner with the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, and she just provided or helped provide all the data for this presentation a couple weeks ago at the Advisory Planning Commission of TRPA, who adopted this, as well as the RPIC, the Regional Plan Committee, also who adopted this. And Alyssa, I'll turn it over to you from here.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Alyssa Bettinger. I'm a senior planner with TRPA, and I was the project manager for the Phase 2 housing amendments. I am going to keep this presentation relatively high level. Like Cindy said, we are happy to answer questions that are put in the chat throughout the presentation at the end. Let's see. I don't see my slides. Are my slides up?
I don't think they're up yet, Alyssa.
Okay.
Erin, can you share the slides that from TRPA? There we go. Thank you.
Perfect. Great. And we can actually go to the next slide. So before I get into the background on the Phase 2 housing amendments, I just wanted to give some context for how these fit in with TRPA's overall initiative on affordable housing, affordable and workforce housing. Like Cindy said, this is a multi-year initiative that our board directed us to work on back in 2020. We have split it up into three kind of key phases of changes. Phase one made some changes to really encourage accessory dwelling units on smaller parcels and sort of changed the way that we permitted older motels that were converting to long-term housing. We wrapped that phase up back in 2021. Phase 2, which again, like Cindy said, our board approved back in December of 2023, a little over a year ago. That's the focus of today's town hall. And that phase was really looked at the standards that we require buildings to meet and the impact of those development standards on the overall cost to build and ultimately how expensive or not expensive it is to occupy those units when they're either sold or rented. Phase 3, which is in progress right now, that is going, or we're through that process, we'll be looking at some of our long-standing systems and programs, like our development rights system and our coverage system and our fee structure, really through the lens of making housing more affordable, making it more affordable to build smaller homes, and kind of looking at it through the lens of creating an equitable impact structure for housing in the basin. And so I know many of you are involved in that already, but if you would like to be involved in that moving forward, shoot me an email and I can get you on our e-news list. Next slide, please. So like Cindy mentioned, the focus of today is to talk about the Phase 2 affordable and workforce housing amendments that our board has passed, and now the local jurisdictions are going through the process of adopting those amendments into the area plans. Throughout the process of Phase 2, we knew that our development standards, and when I say development standards, I mean our height requirements, our density standards, coverage requirements, and parking, those all kind of fall into the category of development standards, and they really impact the cost it is, or the cost to build a residential unit. And throughout some consultant analysis that we did, we realized, and actually just talking to local property owners trying to build ADUs or a duplex or a triplex, some consultants, we realized that we're incentivizing property owners to build larger homes, larger single-family homes that ultimately are unaffordable when they are rented or sold to the local workforce. And so the phase two amendments really focused on making some changes to those standards in order to incentivize builders to construct deed restricted homes. And so I'm not going to go into detail about our deed restriction program that we have at TRPA. Cindy talked about it a little bit. And I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of this, but the changes that are on this slide and the next slide only apply to deed restricted housing only. And we do monitor that housing every year. We also, with the approved changes, there are kind of two sets of changes. One are the changes in our town centers that allow an expanded building envelope, because we really do want to encourage that redevelopment of old existing development into housing or mixed use with a housing component. And then the second, the second set of changes, which is on the next slide, are our changes to our multifamily zone. So these are kind of scaled down changes that still encourage the development of deed restricted housing, but they're not at the same scale as what we want to see in our town centers. Because again, we kind of want we want it to fit within our residential neighborhoods. So I'll just talk through quickly about the approved changes. Within town centers, we are allowing an additional story of height, again, only for deed restricted housing. Our board approved higher coverage also for deed restricted housing if that development can tie into a stormwater treatment system. And just having talked to quite a few developers in about a year that this has been approved, we do know that this is a challenge because not many of these stormwater systems exist right now. So this is kind of the first step, but we know that we're going to need to take more steps in the future for developers to actually be able to utilize this additional coverage incentive. We did pass higher density standards that really encourage more smaller units to be built within a footprint. We know that smaller units are cheaper to occupy, and we don't have the smaller units are in demand and that we have right now, and so we need more of them. And then last, we reduced the parking requirements for deed restricted housing as well, because we were hearing that so much of the land is dedicated to parking that it oftentimes becomes infeasible financially for developers to actually build the type of housing that we want to see given the parking requirements. And we'll go to the next slide, please. So in areas that are already zoned for multifamily housing, so in Placer County, this is the Kings Beach grid. There's some areas in Tahoe City, and a few kind of in between Kings Beach and Tahoe City down in the Homewood area. But we made some changes that are really limited to trying to fit housing into our residential neighborhoods that exist today. And so we didn't approve any additional height for these areas, but we did approve a more flexible roof pitch. So someone could have about a 36-foot high home, but instead of having a very steep roof pitch, they can actually build a slightly flatter roof that allows them to utilize that third story instead of just having kind of like that A-frame style house. And this also helps with energy efficiency, and there's a lot of benefits there. Our board did approve additional land coverage with the same requirement that they tie into a stormwater treatment system. We raised density limits to, again, encourage those smaller units. And then we did reduce parking requirements. But in these areas, as well as in town centers, developers, still have to show us that they have to show us what the parking demand of their specific site will be. And they have to justify going below the parking requirements that are allowed today. So there are still some safeguards in place that prevent, parking overflow. And again, all of these changes are only for deed restricted units. And let's go to the next slide. So local jurisdictions use area plans as their zoning documents, and a lot of these standards that I'm talking about today, or that we're talking about today, like density and height and parking, are also listed in the area plan. So in addition to the TRPA code, Placer County has their area plan, which lists what these standards are as well. And so even if TRPA changes our code with the changes that I just went through, they don't actually go into effect until the area plans are updated. And so throughout the basin, the local jurisdictions are going through that process right now. And given the challenge with that TRPA faced with implementing these changes, and the challenges and ultimately the controversy, we knew that these changes would be very difficult, if not impossible, for the local jurisdictions to do themselves. And so, similar to state mandated housing laws from the state of California, TRPA has a similar mechanism that we can use to mandate that the local jurisdictions implement our changes into their area plans within 1 year or come up with an alternative. So we did have some options for local jurisdictions. They could either opt in and adopt the changes as is. They could opt out and propose alternative changes with equal or greater benefit. Or TRPA can adopt the area plan for them if they don't want to go through either of those options. And so I will let Placer kind of talk through their plan and their process for adopting these amendments. But from TRPA's end, we are taking the amendments to the Placer County Tahoe Basin Area Plan to our governing board this month. So we are, actively taking a step to amend the area plan, but Placer County does still need to go through the CEQA process on their end in order for these changes ultimately to be effective. So next slide, please. So that's all I've got. My email is up on the slide here. I'm happy to get in touch with anyone following this meeting if anyone wants to chat or just has any questions. But with that, I will pass it back over to either Cindy or Chris.
Well, I'm going to jump in because we haven't found the chat box or Q&A down at the bottom. So Alyssa, while I still have you, can I, some of the emails I've received and comments I've already received, maybe you could address those now because I think they're more directed at TRPA. So one I received earlier today was, why are we focused on the town centers? Isn't that going to bring more traffic?
Yeah, that's a great question. The town centers were identified in the 2012 regional plan that we did. And they're basically our commercial centers as they exist today. So it's where a lot of the services are, a lot of like grocery stores, kind of like your main amenities. And so we are really focused on putting housing in our town centers because we want to reduce overall traffic in the basin. And by putting housing near amenities and services that people need, on a regular basis, they are able to, in an ideal world, they're able to walk or even bike sometimes to the grocery store, or their trips are much shorter if they are driving versus putting housing kind of out in the more residential areas, kind of further towards the woods and the forest. That has its own challenges with wildfire risk, but also that just creates a longer trip length and essentially kind of forces people to drive. So that's one reason. And then we also have a lot of development in our existing centers, and we would love, a lot of that development is very old, and we would love to see some of that turn over because we get water quality benefits with that redevelopment. And so that's another reason why we're very focused on our town centers.
And for those of you watching, I know we're going to find a way for you to be able to ask questions, but I'm going to ask Alyssa a couple more that came in on email earlier today. Why the height? Why are we focused and why are we trying to help developers? And so maybe talk about both of those together, because we have a lot, and we actually have, looking at the participant list, we have a number of local builders who I don't think consider themselves necessarily developers, but are interested in doing projects here. So if you could address those.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we were going through the phase 2 process, we did hire a consultant to do what we call a housing pro forma. And that basically means you choose a property in the basin and you do kind of like a mock development scenario, and you look at all the financials that go into that. So, and using the development standards that we have today. And so we were able to sort of identify the pinch points of like our density standards are too low to even allow a duplex to be built on a standard size lot. If we were to allow higher density, what would be kind of the next pinch point? And so our consultant identified, density, height, and coverage were really, when taken together, you need you need to allow an expanded building footprint in order to um, make it more affordable for the occupant. And we found that with the height specifically, we were able to get the price points for both rental and sale pretty close to the achievable level, which is our highest deed restriction level. And so our board felt it was very important to try to get that price point down as far as we could. And the height is, we understand it's a concern in a lot of places, but for town centers, our board did feel that it was very important to keep that component in order to reduce that price point.
Great, thank you. And then finally, on the parking requirements, there's concern about spillover. You mentioned that there will still be review by TRPA, and there will have to be addressing that. But as I understood it, and as I talked to my colleagues in other jurisdictions, if housing isn't met and developers have their option, they don't have to comply with local planning code. By us taking the initiative and adopting these amendments, we have control over those codes. And I think Crystal and Chris can speak more to that when we get to the county. But Alyssa, if you want to talk about the parking as part of that package, because certainly when we look at the cost of providing housing and parking, it all adds up to why we have no new multifamily housing going in.
Yeah, another good question. So with parking, right now there's requirements to build parking. I think in Placer County, it's typically about 2 spaces per unit. And that is just a requirement for really any type of housing. And it's not location specific. So if you are, in a town center or close to a town center, it's just two spaces per unit. And sometimes people don't need 2 spaces per unit. Especially if it's a smaller, studio unit or 1-bedroom unit. And so we reduce the parking, or we approved changes that allow a reduced parking standard. But we would only allow that reduced parking standard if a developer does a parking study where they look at their site and potentially if they are close to a town center or in a town center, maybe there's a commercial business next door to their site that they can share parking. They don't need to build more parking. They can share that existing parking and use more of their site for housing. And so we wanted to provide for those potential kind of unique strategies that allow for just better site utilization and allow us to use less, I guess, pavement for parking. But yes, they do have to submit a study to us. We are working on a basin-wide study that developers could use so they could, we're looking at existing deed restricted developments and their parking demand rates for those. And so a developer could use that once it's finalized to get a slightly lower parking rate. But in order to get, the parking ratios or the parking rates that we passed with phase 2, they would need to do their own site specific parking analysis and show that, the demand, they can meet the demand.
And Alyssa, even if TRPA approved it, the county then has enforcement to deal with. And I'm very aware that we're working with our communities right now on parking management and parking enforcement in our ordinances. So I think ultimately we can do studies, but I think most of the public is concerned that parking will spill over. And then what are we doing to remedy that as we move forward? I've received a few text questions as well. I'm going to stop questions for just a minute for Alyssa, let Crystal and Chris and Emily take over from here. And then we'll come back, and I'm just going to ask you to raise your hands and we'll call on you, open it up so you can ask your question directly. I apologize for this. I thought we had a chat box or Q&A so you could do that, but we'll do it the old-fashioned way with raising your hand. We'll call on you after they're done with their presentation. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you, or Crystal. I'm not sure who I'm going to first.
I'll just do a quick little introduction for our team. So thank you, Supervisor Gustafson, for holding this evening's town hall meeting. I'm Chris Hooley. I am Placer County's Planning Director, joined here with Crystal Jacobson, our Assistant Community Development Resource Agency Director, and Emily Setzer, Principal Planner in our Planning Services Division. As Alyssa mentioned earlier, as a result of TRPA's governing board's action to amend their code of ordinances, we are in the process now of amending the Tahoe Basin Area Plan, and it is handled, as I'm sure many people on this town hall meeting know, in a two-step process. So typically, Placer County goes through a process of amending the TBAP, and TRPA then amends the TBAP following Placer County's actions. And that's exactly the process that we're going to be following here, is that two-step process. Although, as Alyssa mentioned, TRPA's governing board is scheduled to take on these TBAP amendments at the end of this month, and Placer County's process, as Emily will outline, will take a little bit longer to work through. So I'm going to ask Emily to walk through the presentation, talking a little bit more about the background, our process, and the timeline for Placer County's adoption. So Emily.
Thank you. I'm Emily Setzer, Principal Planner with Placer County in our Tahoe City office. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit of a recap of what Alyssa explained, but we do have 3 options for adoption. That's the 3 options that TRPA presented to the local jurisdictions. So the first option was for the county to amend the Tahoe Basin Area Plan to incorporate the Phase 2 amendments as is, so as they were adopted by TRPA. The second option was to propose an alternative set of amendments that were at least as effective as the TRPA amendments, in reducing the cost of constructing affordable, moderate, and achievable housing. And because it has 1 year has gone by since TRPA did adopt the code changes to their code and regional plan, TRPA is moving forward with the adoption process on their side. We do still have a role at Placer County in amending the area plan. We are required to follow the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. So we need to assume lead agency and the lead agency role and conduct the environmental analysis for any code amendments to our area plan. And then because our area plan is a joint document between TRPA and Placer County, our Board of Supervisors also need to approve any area plan amendments. And we want to make sure that projects could utilize the amendments. So in order for that to happen, we need to conduct the environmental analysis and bring it to our Planning Commission and board for approval. So that's the process we are working with. Next slide, please. So we went to our Board of Supervisors on February 4th last month to seek direction and guidance on how they would like staff to proceed with these amendments, whether they wanted us to look at an alternative set of amendments or to adopt them as is. And our board directed staff to submit a notice of intent to TRPA indicating that we would go ahead and amend our area plan to include the Phase 2 amendments as TRPA adopted them, to conduct the environmental analysis, and to proceed with Board of Supervisors adoption. I will say that we have had several people in our community who are local and do work in the development arena who are looking forward to these amendments. We've heard to go ahead and build workforce housing, something that we haven't had really built in decades. Next slide, please. So our timeline for proceeding with board direction is we are going to follow closely the TRPA adoption. So we are anticipating the TRPA governing board to approve the Phase 2 amendments to our area plan on March 26th. On April 1st, we are going to our board to seek approval of a funding agreement between TRPA and Placer County to help cover the costs of conducting the environmental analysis. TRPA did get state grant funding to analyze the amendments that went forward, so they are helping to cover those costs. And then we expect to initiate our environmental review of the amendments this spring. And we do anticipate bringing it back to our Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors by the end of this year, the end of 2025. That does depend on the level of analysis required, but at this time, we anticipate that to be a realistic expectation for timeline. Next slide, please. And my contact information is up here if anybody has any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. And one other item that I think we need clarification on that I was supposed to bring up earlier. And Alyssa, I'm sorry to put you back on the spot, but all of these amendments continue our building caps within the Tahoe Basin. In other words, these aren't additional bodies that are additional units that are coming in. They're under the current development caps that we have for the Tahoe Basin. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we didn't increase the amount of development potential with these amendments. It's all within the existing units that we have available right now.
Right. I think that's really important because I know our public is concerned about what they feel is overdevelopment, new development, and redevelopment. Okay. I know a few of you have texted me. Can you raise your hands in the chat and I'll call on you in order I see them and you can ask your question live. And the first hand up is Kristen. And somebody will unmute Kristen and let her ask her question.
Hi there. In my opinion, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks,
Great.
Kristen.
The only way to responsibly have more affordable housing is to limit short-term rentals. There's over 3,000 short-term rentals in Eastern Placer County, and you guys need 400 supposedly or more, obviously. But if you start limiting those short-term rentals, you will see so much more housing. So that's my 2 cents on short-term housing. Short-term rentals. Also, regarding parking, if these developers or builders, local builders even, can afford to build these, they certainly can afford to have parking lots, because if they don't have parking areas, then the taxpayers are going to be responsible for the extra wear and tear on our streets and stuff. And I personally don't think that's fair to the taxpayer, because we don't get any say in this, and we don't make any money on this. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. Next hand I see raised is Brad Altman.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for putting on this town hall. So I am the principal engineer of Evolve Design Works in Tahoe City, and we are currently working on a redevelopment project in the Lake Forest neighborhood that could create 9 deed-restricted workforce housing units. And it's important for people to understand that right now we could get a permit from TRPA, but not a permit from Placer County, because Placer County is yet to adopt the TBAP. So people love to hate TRPA, but in this case, TRPA is kind of ahead of the game here, and Placer County is a little bit playing catch up. I want people to really understand that when we talk about redevelopment, we are not talking about developing a meadow, a forest, anything like that. This is an existing parcel that has almost 52% verified existing coverage by TRPA. And we are proposing to use that coverage to create 9 achievable workforce housing units. And we have 9 parking spaces. It's important to understand that to make this pencil out, if it doesn't pencil out, people aren't going to do anything. And then you're stuck with the old that you already have. So improper water infiltration and no housing. So this is a good thing. I really hope that Placer County can get this adopted soon so we can move our project forward. And the developer of the project, people like to use the word developer, this is a local business owner and his wife. They each own a business in Tahoe City, in Placer County, and they just need housing for their employees. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for sharing that story. And I really want to say yes in my backyard, because I live in Lake Forest and I know the property, and that would be a great reuse of a very old property. So thank you. Next hand up I see is Sue.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
we can.
okay, great. All right. Thanks so much. I would like clarity on density, because I know this is confusing people all the time. But if you have a parcel that was an old house or such, and then you're turning it into 9 houses, to me and to a lot of the public, that means more density. It definitely means more people, and it usually means more vehicles. And also, when you are allowing more height, that usually means you can put more units into a property, which means more density. So I think that we need, as a public, to understand it more clearly, of the difference between redevelopment of current density, but creating more units.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue, for those questions. And I'm not sure who would like to take that.
This is Crystal. I'm happy to answer that question or provide some clarity there. Crystal Jacobson, I'm the Assistant Director of Community Development for Placer County. And I understand this confusion about density, and so hopefully I can help to provide some clarification here. So our current TBAP and most zoning ordinances have standards regarding how many units per acre you can have on a piece of property. So, and we call that density, the density allowance. And so when we have said that the amendments don't increase density, it's that there's not a change to those standards. So what these amendments that TRPA approved do is to encourage housing by eliminating some standards like parking, and then adding some incentives on things like the height allowance so that you can go a little higher as a way to try to get more units on the property, or actually I would say realize the density on that site. So what we have seen is, let's just say a property is zoned for multifamily, and they have a density standard, a current density standard of 15 dwelling units per acre. Just because they have that density standard, a lot of these properties aren't able to achieve that standard because the other standards like height limits, the number of parking stalls that you have to construct for a project, really are barriers to actually get that density. So this eliminates some of those barriers, allows us to actually get some of that density on site. So yes, it could result in more units that you'll see on a piece of property, perhaps, but it's not a change to the standard that is allowed under the code. So you might see, Sue, as you noted, additional units, perhaps additional parking or cars on site, additional people on site. But it's important to note that the standard hasn't changed. The other thing that hasn't changed is that there's no change to the overall growth caps that TRPA has in place. So the overall density of Placer County portion of the basin as a whole, the population number is not changing altogether. So that's capped in terms of how many units we can see in the basin because of those growth control limits. So while you might see some, a property next to you perhaps might be developed as a result of this, you might get those 9 units on that property there, and that Brad Allman had just mentioned, and it might bring additional people to that site. It's not over and above what is allowed in terms of the current density standard, and it does not change the overall cap of density that is allowed in the basin.
Thanks, Crystal. I think the other thing is these amendments apply only to the town centers in the commercial cores and multifamily zoned properties, correct?
Correct. I might point to Alyssa on that, but just to make sure I've got that right.
And the reason I bring this up is I've heard this in neighborhoods that people are concerned all of a sudden they're going to see these projects in their single family neighborhoods. But what it does mean for Sue and others is if there's 9 units built at this particular site that Brad shared, that means there's 8 single family homes that won't go up elsewhere, that are larger and more expensive and won't provide local housing. They'll most likely be developed for second homeowners. And so, yes, we're trying to push those uses into these areas that are already zoned multifamily and or the town centers. Is that correct? I want to make sure I'm not misleading anybody.
That's right. I mean, really,
it's really important to me that we're clear on that.
Right.
Yeah.
The units are going to be smaller in nature because they're workforce housing units. So, but again, the unit number in total is capped in the basin. So it's not like we're proposing, additional
Right.
units, additional growth. You might see something, come to fruition on one site where perhaps it wasn't, going to be developed previously, but it doesn't mean that the overall number's going up.
I think that's really important for folks to understand on that. And we'll go to our next question, Tracy Brostek. Did I get your last name correct? I'm sorry if I didn't. Tracy? Okay, then I see Megan Chalemi. Hi, Megan. I think you're unmuted. No, maybe.
Can you
Megan,
hear
are
me,
you?
Cindy?
I can, Megan.
Yes.
Tracy, we'll come back to you. I'm not sure why you didn't unmute. So,
Ah,
okay.
well, good evening. Good to see everyone. Thank you. Just kind of a basic question is, my husband and I are the original homeowners of our house in Kings Beach. We purchased it in 1982. And a question I've had for quite a while, was there a zoning change in the Kings Beach grid from single family to multifamily at some point of time?
I'm not
I'm not-
aware of any. When the area plan got adopted, it rolled over the previous zoning. And the entire Kings Beach residential zone district in the Kings Beach grid has been a mixture of multifamily and single family since at least the 60s.
Yeah, and I'll just tag on to that, Emily. I worked on the Tahoe Basin Area Plan when it was initially adopted or updated in 2017, and there was not a change at that time. And then prior to that, the last update to the plans was in 1996. I wasn't around at Placer in 1996, but I don't think there had been a change to that site. There's always been an allowance for residential there. Does that answer the question, hopefully?
Okay. Tracy, we'll call on Tracy. And if you need follow-up, I do want to say if you need follow-up on any of these, please email the staff here or our office and we'll get answers back to you. Because we have a few weeks here before TRPA adopts it and then the county process. So we have time to respond to your questions in more detail. I'm sorry, Tracy, go ahead.
Are you there?
Yes.
Hello?
We can.
Yes. Sorry, I'm working on it. I'm on an old computer and there's quite a delay. I'm wondering if there's going to be, first I want to thank Brad because he really provided some information I wasn't aware of. And that was enlightening. And I appreciate this platform. It does provide some clarity. Will there be a town hall meeting for this in person so that you can get public representation, like enforced?
I can speak to that.
Thank you, Emily.
Sure. Yes, public input and attendees are welcome at all of the hearings going forward. So March 26th at the TRPA Governing Board, the public is welcome to attend and provide public comment. We don't yet have the dates for our planning commission or our board of supervisors, but we will be sure to announce those and work with our public information office to share those when we get closer to those dates. I would expect sometime between late summer and fall. But all the public is welcome to attend our planning commission and our board of supervisors hearings and provide comment as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Next, we have Rob Olson.
Hello, this is Rob Olson, and a couple notes. One, I think it could be helpful if staff helped people figure out what their zoning is of their unique parcel, because all of Tahoe is so unique. And there's certain websites that I know how to navigate because I'm in the business and look at what parcels are. But I think a lot of people are worried about that means there's going to be a 7-story building right next to them, and that's not always the case. If they're blessed to live in a town center where they could walk to stores, maybe they will be next to it. But as Crystal said, there are set growth boundaries that TRPA has established in the area. And the problem is they're not being fulfilled by workforce housing. And even if we reduce the STRs, which I agree, we drastically need to look at reducing some STRs. I'm in the architecture and construction industry where people buy them. They don't want to rent them at all. They put multi-million dollars into a property and it's forever going to be off the market for workforce housing. And so what we're talking about is giving opportunity for developers, hopefully local ones, to take a piece of property and say, what else could we do with this instead of putting in boutique condos in there? And hopefully they'll look for housing, and these amendments help someone like me look and say, hey, with this property, we can put workforce housing in there. It starts to make sense. And then we can combat all these premier projects that I do, which are great, but we have bringing people in. And I would argue that most people are looking at this from their perspective of what would I want to live in. And most young people, when they move here, they don't need a car. They're fine walking to work. They're living different lives than a lot of people that are privileged and able to take time out of their day to come to these community meetings. And so don't make decisions for them, because they would love to have that unit. So I do appreciate your effort. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. And next, Sue, is this Sue Daniels again? We already had a question from you. Did you have another question? Sue?
I couldn't answer you until I got unmuted, but thank you. I was thinking I could clarify a little, and I did want to follow up on my first one. But first of all, Megan, yes, a lot of Kings Beach in the upper part used to be all single family residential. The multifamily was down closer to what we call the commercial core now. And that area, when I worked in real estate for years, you would see different, as Rob said, there's different ways you can see on the maps. And Megan's area didn't used to be multi, but maybe it is now. That's just a clarification. Tristan and Rob, I agree on the short-term rental. We have, when I sell houses, and I believe we have approximately 25% of the people that do short-term rentals right now that would happily also rent them long-term. That was our workforce housing, and it's already built. What a treat, if we can look as a government to structure the assets we already have to make it appropriate for people to use those as the business that they want to. I don't think we're putting enough effort into that, and it is already built, and we don't have to spend a lot of extra money. My other question on density, as I asked earlier, following up, because ADUs are now allowed on parcels in California, that does change density. And so I think that it is just a comment I wanted to make, that we need to realize that we are increasing density just by that law change, and amongst other things. I want workforce housing. I am a real proponent for it, but I don't want the government to have to build it all and have to give gifts for it. So I'm trying to work a way to, do that. And I think one of the ways is limiting our short-term rentals. So, but thank you again.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Sue. Next, I was going to go to, let's see, I have an iPhone 12 Pro. iPhone 12 Pro. Can you unmute and ask your question?
I don't think they're, maybe we move on to the next one, Supervisor, and come back to them. They're not responding.
Okay, great. Samir Tuma.
Good evening. Thank you all for convening this meeting. I think it's helpful and interesting to hear what you're trying to achieve, and also some of the challenges. I want to go back to a comment I think that Alyssa made, which is that one of the problems with the existing code is that it really incentivizes larger homes. And so if you look at what's happened in our community over the last 30 or 40 years, we tend to get larger homes built. So what I think you're trying to accomplish here, one of the things is that instead of getting one 4-bedroom house, perhaps we wind up with 4 1-bedroom units. And what that does is that builds housing that is as I like to call it, affordable by design. It's smaller units, they're more affordable, and those are the kinds of places that a lot of our workforce can afford to live. A 4-bedroom house is really expensive, either to buy or to rent. On the topic of parking in the town center, I know this has been alluded to in concept a couple of different times during the conversation, but I want to talk about a specific project that we just completed in Tahoe City. We took an old commercial building and converted it into a dormitory. We have 28 people living in that dormitory. And it is right in the heart of Tahoe City, and exactly 0 of them have cars. And they go to work on TART and TART Connect. They walk to the amenities, the grocery stores, the things that they need. And so we were able to get 28 people living in the town center with 0 cars. So it is. I think Rob said it as well. There's a portion of the workforce that they don't have a car, they don't want a car, and these smaller units really work. One of the challenges on coverage, as has been proposed by TRPA, or I guess passed by TRPA at this point, is that in order to get a little bit more coverage, you have to be able to hook up to a system that will take the drainage. And there just aren't very many places that do that. And so I'm afraid that this coverage allowance here is really not going to work. And I was wondering, and maybe it's too late, but if there was some other way to allow for a slight increase in coverage by things like buying and transferring coverage in, not having to pay excess coverage mitigation fees because you're trying to create these deed restricted housing. But the coverage piece is still very, very difficult. And so to create, like I said, 4 1-bedrooms with parking versus 1 4-bedroom with parking, you that's an example of where you need you need some flexibility on the coverage. And so that would be my one question here is there some other mechanism, not for just saying unlimited coverage, but for allowing a little bit more coverage if you have these smaller units, so that you could accommodate the buildings themselves and the parking. It's not a matter of being able to afford to build the parking. It's a matter of being able to put the parking on a lot where your coverage is limited. And thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you, Samir. Alyssa, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I can tackle that one. Thanks, Samir. Right now, the changes that our board approved are, only do allow that higher coverage with the stormwater requirement, the stormwater system requirement. And we do know that that is pretty limited as as they're built right now. Our hope is that in the future, more of these come along, and potentially with the help of some of these housing developments, because they are, we know that they're expensive and they're, it's challenging, but they really do treat our water, very efficiently. And so that was kind of the basis for, our board approving the changes with the requirement for the stormwater system. I think we are certainly continuing to have that conversation about coverage, and we are talking about it, in the next phase of cultivating communities, conserving the basin. That's the phase 3 of our housing initiative. And so I know you're involved in that, but definitely just your input and expertise in that would be helpful for our continued process.
Great. Thanks, Alyssa. And again, for the rest of the public, there is a phase 3 that will be beginning, and we'll be talking about at both TRPA and then I would assume back at the county as well, depending on the recommendations that come out of the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. Next hand up, Mike LaFrancois. Mike.
Good evening. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great, thank you. I had a question regarding the old Tahoe Inn up near Crystal Bay, California side. I was kind of surprised to see that's still slated to come down. I know it's, a complicated project, but in anybody's, TRPA or Placer County's eyes, is there opportunity there? I don't know how many rooms are in that motel, but it seems like it's an opportunity missed if that whole thing goes away. And maybe it's so far gone, doesn't meet code, but just wanted to hear from you guys what you might think.
Thanks, Mike. I don't know if anybody from the county or TRPA, but I know that I've had discussions with a number of community groups that are very interested in trying to redevelop that site. As a condition of approval, Homewood or JMA, anything they're transferring to their new site, they must remove and restore that site. But I think, and they've assured me there's not much to get from trying to I guess the cost of redoing that building would be pretty dramatic. But you're absolutely right. It's a great site. There's a lot of employers close to state line. We see a lot of employees living in our Kings Beach area, commuting over to the casinos, and always have had that draw there. So certainly I think there's some groups working on it, and I think it's a great thing for us to pursue and see if we can make one of those projects happen. I don't know if Crystal or Chris or Emily or Alyssa want to speak to that because there isn't anything submitted yet, but there are a number of people talking about what can we do to preserve some housing on that site.
I don't think they can.
This is Crystal again. I don't think there's anything formal that's been submitted on that. There's been, several years ago, there was a pre-development application that was submitted from Homewood for redevelopment of the site for workforce housing. And there's been a lot of conversation around that. But I don't think, I might look to Chris on this. I don't think we've seen anything formal come in recently.
No, you're right. Nothing recent.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Mike, we'll keep working on that because I know that there's some conditions of approval that maybe JMA has to take it down from TRPA standpoint, but from the community standpoint, how can we best utilize that piece of property? Next up, I see Mo. I'm going to get your name wrong. Dermasian? Was I close? Mo? Mo, can you unmute?
I've asked a couple times, Supervisor. Let me try one more time.
Okay. And I wanted to go back to iPhone 12 as well. If iPhone 12 wants to unmute and ask a question, either one of you, before I go back to Brad, because Brad's already had a chance.
I'm asking to unmute with no. Let me try again. Okay, iPhone 12 Pro is
And you
should be
hear
there.
me now?
There you are.
Yes, I am. Hooray.
Yay!
My name is Gail High and I live in Kings Beach. The thing that has concerned me all along with this, and I haven't followed it as closely recently, is the idea that it sounds like without a maximum amount of income, that the workforce housing could become anything but workforce housing. And that's what we really need is workforce, and we don't need people that are looking for a deal that are working just a few hours. Can you reassure me on that?
Absolutely, Gail. And I'll leave it to both Alyssa and Emily, and I may chime in too.
I can speak to that.
Okay.
Alyssa, if you want to jump in, if anything I didn't cover. All of the units that would be built that would apply under these amendments would have to be deed restricted. And so that deed restriction would require people to either have a household income of less than 120% of the area median income, or they would have to be local workers. And while it's true that at the higher end of that, our local workers don't have a prescriptive income cap, we do know that our local workers, their incomes are not the same as many of our Bay Area competitors, for example. Additionally, any of the deed restricted units would be pulling what was called a residential bonus unit from TRPA, and that's a development right that lets them build a residential unit on that site. And that pool of residential units is broken out by affordability levels. So half of that pool is reserved exclusively for affordable housing. So that's people making under 80% of the area median income. The other 25% of that pool is reserved for people reserved for affordable or moderate income housing. So moderate goes up to 120% of area median income. And then the last 25% is available for affordable, moderate, or achievable, or that local worker. So of the remaining, I'm gonna say roughly 900 to 1,000 residential bonus units in the entire basin that TRPA has available right now, half of those would be affordable, and then the other 25 and 25% would be affordable or affordable, moderate, or achievable. So there are income restrictions. It's just a little like one step removed from the process.
Great. And Gail, I want to thank you for asking that, because when we started this whole issue of workforce housing back in 2014 and 2015, recognizing we were losing dramatically our local workforce, we talked to many employers, and when we showed the price ranges of 80% and below and 120% and below, many of the local employers had managers in their businesses that were above that income cap, but couldn't buy a house because our average house now is gone well over $1 million. And so what we want to make sure of is that they do work for a locally based employer. They're not a Google person coming into town to take advantage of these units and remote working, that they work for a locally based employer within the Tahoe Truckee Unified School District boundaries. It's very important to us all that that we not establish that and then check once a year with the deed
I'm
restriction
not very good at
program
this
that
computer
they're
stuff.
meeting that.
Can you hear me now? No, no.
Is that iPhone 12? Is that Gail again?
Um,
Gail,
can
we
you
can
hear
hear
me?
you.
Oh, you
Yes.
can. Okay.
Yeah.
So it just seems like there should be some better way to gain the individuality that's needed for those higher not executives, but it just seems like more of it should be capped so that we really get the people that need it.
Right. And so if you have, for instance, one of the examples we had was 2 school teachers,
Mhm.
That would be overqualified for the median income, but would qualify in the achievable. But we're certainly open to other ideas. Whatever number we set, we certainly can reconsider how we establish that. But rest assured, they have to prove that they're working in a local for a locally based employer in the region in order. And then the other thing that we have seen from other jurisdictions like Vail, Colorado, they had the same thing, that teachers, firefighters, often kind of the middle class, what I would always say was, that they're making a little too much to qualify for these affordable ranges. And it's really important to the fabric of our community. Those are the people who are often your AYSO coaches and your parent volunteers in your
Absolutely.
schools. And I think for those of us who had that opportunity, I got to raise my kids here and participate in all those things. And I can only pay that forward and hope that we can create a system that helps people. So we'll take that into account and make sure we have, I think now, Emily, 14 houses that have closed escrow where we've helped people buy a home with those criteria. And I believe all of those are really great success stories that we need to share more of who we're helping purchase some of the existing homes in our community. These deed restrictions are really placed on more of the new projects or renovation projects that would be more designed as apartments. So I don't see that there's going to be a high demand necessarily in these units for the higher end incomes. They're going to be living in a more multifamily complex. So thanks for the question. I wanted to go to Mo, whose hand is back up. Dermengian. Mo, can you unmute? Mo? I'm so sorry I've scrambled your last name, but hopefully you know Mo is easy enough. Well, if Mo, if you can hear us, please submit any questions and we'll make sure they get answered. And then I've got 2 more hands that have already spoken. I'm going to go to Kristen first to wrap up, and then to Brad. And then again, I'm going to ask everyone to submit questions or comments to us. We'll be happy to get you answers and get back to you on your suggestions and ideas of how we address workforce housing here.
Hi, you can hear me, I assume.
Yes, Kristen.
Okay, so I'm super glad to hear that the people for this housing needs to be local workforce. Is that first of all, is that for all the units? And then I assume that it's for purchasing. What is it continuous? Like when they end up selling it, is that still deed restricted? Is this forever and ever is one of my questions. And also, how do we avoid the something happening here that happened with the artist lofts in Truckee, where because it's considered low income, it ended up becoming a little bit of a there's problems over there, I guess I'll just say.
Yeah, I can speak to that. And then Alyssa, I'll let you talk about the length of the TRPA deed restrictions. All of the units that could be built under these amendments allowances would be deed restricted. That would require annual monitoring so that TRPA would look at the occupants of those units on an annual basis to make sure that they're meeting the requirements of that deed restriction, the income or the local worker requirements. I'll let Alyssa speak to how long that deed restriction lasts. Our county deed restrictions last 55 years. If the unit is sold, then typically, say under our workforce housing preservation program, that deed restriction starts again for the new owner. So in essence, those go into in perpetuity. But they are a very long time because we want to have workforce housing for decades, not just a short-term vision here. For artist lofts, I think that project in particular in downtown Truckee has garnered a lot of attention. But I do want to say that every single affordable housing project has different managers. And the management on a property can make a really big difference to that specific project. And the ongoing behavior of folks living in that project as well. Artist lofts actually came into it got developed the same time as Coldstream Crossing and Meadowview. So Coldstream Crossing is by Donner Lake, Meadowview Apartments, which is in Martis Valley. And all 3 are affordable housing projects that came online at the same time. They all filled up with occupants. There are waiting lists for all of those developments. And, the only one we hear about is Artist Lofts. So I want to put out some positive press for some of the other 2 that came online at the same time, because it would be unfortunate if one project shadows all of the others that have provided workforce and affordable housing for our communities.
Can I
Alyssa,
just interrupt for 1 second? Sorry, Alyssa. So I'm just curious, like, let's say I bought one of these apartments at a lower price because I am a local and I work locally and I make X amount of dollars. Then in a year or 2 years, am I allowed to sell it for twice as much and 3 times as much so locals can no longer afford it?
Thing that would be sold. So all of these units could be either rentals or for sale. That we don't have anything preventing either one. But if it is for sale, it would, whatever deed restriction was put on it, so say it was the upper end, the achievable income limit, or local worker, then whoever you sold it to would also have to meet that same criteria. So it would be very unlikely that if you bought a unit for, I'm just going to throw out a number, 400,000, and you thought you could sell it for $1 million, a few years later, that any local worker would actually be able to afford that much higher of a price point under those deed restrictions. So in essence, the affordability should continue on through every owner because every future owner still needs to be a local worker household.
Yeah, and I can follow up a bit. Some of these units will be rentals and not for sale, but in the ones that were for sale in our deed restriction program, we copied what Vail, Colorado did, and their resale has been very strong, but they've really created a secondary real estate market because the local employees can't afford as much. And so they are required, and that's 55 years. That's then renewed another 55 years, correct, Emily?
Yes.
So when it's sold. So yes, we want them to be able to build equity and pride in home ownership and be able to sell for a bit more, but that'll be dependent on who's in the local workforce and what they can afford to purchase them for. It's been successful in other areas. We haven't gotten to that point where anyone's sold their units yet. So that'll be when we test, if our theory of what worked in Colorado is going to work here. Alyssa, did you want to add anything on that?
I was just gonna add that our deed restrictions are in perpetuity. So they transfer over, like you both were saying, when the unit is sold, or when the occupant changes.
Great, thank you. And then I saw Niobe's hand go back up. And we could sit here all night with a few of you have come put your hands back up. So Niobe, I'm going to ask for you to go, and then back to Brad. And then I think we should end again with asking everyone to submit your questions and comments. We have a couple of weeks till the TRPA meeting. And I hate to cut people off, but I want to make sure we get through these. So Niobe?
Hi, everyone. Yes, you guys have done a lot of work on this, I know, and trying to iron out the details, so appreciated. There are some things that obviously I agree again with the others about the SDR limits, and I think we should be working on that in conjunction with us somehow. And it had two-part question. One is, if there are plans for future stormwater systems in Eastern Placer County that would go and coincide with developing housing? And then what incentives are there for redevelopment and in the areas of moderate? Because those moderate units, bonus units or allocations seem to be the area that are least attractive to the developers.
Staff right now are working to determine which area stormwater treatment systems that are in place today could handle additional workforce housing projects. So we are currently working on that determination right now. Right now, I think any projects coming forward in an area that does not have active stormwater treatment systems would have to build their own. So we're working with TRPA through the Tahoe Living Working Group to figure out what changes potentially could be made in the future to allow more flexible coverage for workforce housing projects. So right now, I think some of the ones that we have in Eastern Placer that we are looking to see if they could hold more capacity are the ones in the Kings Beach area and the Dollar Point area. And then you have your town centers, so they have more capacity than the ones outside of the town centers. And Niobe, I apologize. Could you repeat the second part of that question?
Unmute, unmute, unmute.
You're
there.
good.
You're unmuted. You're done.
Okay, any sort of, are there is any work on developing programs for, toward
Right, the moderate, thank you.
encouragement of moderate and redevelopment?
So we don't have a lot of just undeveloped large tracts of land in the basin for East Placer. So the majority of the housing development that we're predicting to come forward under these amendments would actually be redevelopment, or small lots. So in our town centers, they're largely built out. So a lot of that would be mostly redevelopment. In any areas that are zoned for multifamily outside of the town centers, the majority of those really are smaller lots. So those would likely be redevelopment, or small lot new development. We are working for the county on a program called Launchpad that we hope will get adopted this spring, summer. And that is a financial incentive program to incentivize development of workforce housing. And that would be the county, kind of similar to the Workforce Housing Preservation Program. It would be the county contributing funds in exchange for deed restricting the units to local workers. Right now, I think staff are looking at whether those units would be deed restricted to various income levels or just to achievable overall. Either way, the TRPA pool of residential bonus units that we anticipate most of those builders for new or redeveloped units would use are broken out into the affordability or local worker categories that I described earlier. So, at some point between the financial incentives and the availability of the bonus units, we probably will start to see that moderate income be more utilized.
Great, thanks, Emily. And I have two more commenters. Brad, I'm going to let you go ahead, and then Samir, and then we'll cut it there because everybody has had, I think, a couple of different questions. So that'll leave two for each. So Brad?
Thanks, everybody. I just wanted to kind of go back and address some of the questions and comments others have made. So for our particular project, and I've worked with Rob Olson and everyone that's on this presentation team tonight, we are not talking about building like a 200 or even 100 unit apartment complex that you would see in a city. I just want everyone to make sure they understand that we are not doing that. What this is really going to look like is kind of just a big house, really. And these units are 600 to 800 square feet each, 1 to 2 bedrooms. And this is something that we talk about, yes, would it be nice if someone had a short-term rental and it was a whole house, and wouldn't it be nice if someone rented that? But when you rent that comes along with things like maintenance and snow removal and all the things that a house needs. And when we have this redevelopment of this existing thing, and we have these 9 units, and we have a manager, all that stuff is taken care of, like Emily kind of talked about with what's happening in Truckee. And we have that, from garbage collection to snow removal, etc. We have a full ADA unit. There is virtually no housing that is ADA accessible certainly on the West Shore, North Shore, Tahoe City area. So we're developing that along with the required ADA parking. And that takes up a lot of coverage to have the ADA parking, right? So we have to be creative architecturally. When we're talking about redevelopment, are we talking about increased density? Emily and talked about, and Alyssa talked about, there is a finite number of units, bonus units available. So we're not creating more, we're just allocating it in the right spots. We're putting it where we need to have workers live. Our project is less than 2 miles from the high school and the middle school, less than 2.5 miles from the elementary school. These are all places we need to have people. And also, this is a multifamily home in the neighborhood with deed restrictions for workforce or achievable housing, that's an allowed by right use. There's no conditional use permit. It's not a minor use permit. This is allowed by right. No special privileges. This is not a taxpayer burden. This is a privately funded operation. Certainly our client would love to get maybe a break on permitting fees. He feels like he is standing up and doing the right thing for our community. He and his wife have raised their daughter here and they own businesses here and they're putting their money forward on, I mean, he could bulldoze this whole thing and build a very fancy home and he's not doing that. Would he make more money? Probably, but this isn't the legacy he wants. So this is what we're really talking about when we're talking about redevelopment and creating workforce housing. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. And I know, kudos to the folks and you for this project, that particular project. But one of the things I learned at the California Association of Council of Governments last week is that 95% of the housing being built in the state of California right now is being built by nonprofits. So I think often we hear developers and we think for-profit, large scale developments, resort developers. But these really are a specialty niche that are the only ones who seem to be able to put together the tax credits and incentives on the projects or their local people. And with that, Samir, I'm gonna call on you next.
Thanks, Cindy. Just briefly, we all know what some of the consequences of not building housing, and particularly for the workforce. Businesses struggle, the economy struggles. It gets really hard to have teachers and AYSO, folks, coaches in the community. And so we feel that and we understand that. There is, however, another significant consequence as a result of some legislation that was passed out of Sacramento. And what that is that if the local communities do not live up to their obligations under the California law to build housing, you are potentially subject to something called builder's remedy, which allows builders basically to ignore the local jurisdictions and essentially build what they want. Now, that may sound alarmist. It may sound, that'll never happen. It's happening all over the state of California. And one very specific example, down in the Bay Area, in the community of Menlo Park, there is an area that used to be the Sunset Magazine campus, a couple of low-rise buildings, and it was served gardens and all that sort of stuff. A builder got a hold of that and has submitted and has been approved under the builder's remedy to build 3 buildings. One is 18 stories, one is 33 stories, and one is 37 stories, 446 feet in height. And so I think we just need to be aware that if we think that this can't happen, it can. And that's one of the most egregious examples I've heard of, but it's happening all over the state of California. And so I think part of another consequence of doing nothing here, consequence of not building the kind of smaller, affordable, achievable housing that we're talking about, we could lose local control over what's permitted to happen in these jurisdictions. And so I just really, implore people to think about that consequence, it's something that's not talked about much, but it's very real for some communities in California. Thanks again for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Samir, for sharing that. I know we're all familiar with it on the west side of the county and other areas, how it would play out in TRPAs is, I guess, not well known, but it is important to realize it could happen just outside our boundaries, right? Where a developer would say, we could exercise this right because you haven't met your housing requirements. It is a mandate by the state to meet these housing, at least the minimum. I wanted to mention 2 other things. One is, thank you. First off, thank you all, and thanks to our presenters tonight. I really appreciate your time on a Monday night to come out and help educate the community. Secondly, on April 30th, there will be a Discuss and Discover our semi-annual package the CEO's office has been doing, where we invite numerous groups and presenters to come, and it's a town hall open house, I guess, open house format. I don't know the time. It will be at the Kings Beach Event Center, so stay tuned for that. And I know they're talking about having a housing room set aside to talk about all the different housing programs that we are offering and trying to incentivize to unlock existing units, as well as these amendments to maybe precipitate some opportunities for some redevelopment within our area. And then the third thing I wanted to mention is, and I don't know the meeting dates for this, but the STR, the Short-Term Rental Advisory Committee, is continuing to meet regularly to talk about issues with short-term rentals. Part of our support moving forward was we want to look at methods at which we do reduce those in the outlying areas and bring uses closer to the town centers. And how many units based on any new hotel developments or other issues that come forward. So that is in progress, and I think the committee will be working on those. I know what we've learned from South Shore is that as much as we think they'll open up for long-term rentals, we've seen them go primarily to 30-day renters at South Lake Tahoe, but there certainly are some that may be, and we can't prohibit 30-day rentals and longer. They just don't pay TOT taxes. So we want to be certain of what we do and how we do it, but we certainly know that we need to move forward on short-term rentals as well. So stay tuned for those options. And remember that the TRPA meeting is March 26th. And then we'll keep you posted on when the Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors meetings are. And again, remember that April 30th meeting. So thank you all very much. Appreciate everybody's time tonight. It's after 7:30, so it is time for people to get a bite to eat and get some dinner, and look forward to talking to you all soon. Thanks again, Emily, Chris, Crystal, and Alyssa for your part tonight. Aaron, thanks for being our IT specialist back there, and Sophie and Bridget for helping out too. Thank you all.